Welcome back to Grounded Spirits Podcast, a place where we're learning how to stay rooted while flying high. I'm your host, Laura Lynn, and today is the last day of the Plant Magic series. So for the last 5 weeks, we have been looking at this 514-page book to uncover what the author meant by plant magic. Again, the author is Jessica Huntley, and this is part of the series of the Library of Esoterica. Chapter 5 is called Pollinating Consciousness, and the way that it seems that they're describing it is how plants, we can't get away from them. They show up in all of our art, and so it's kind of like it's like inception of the mind, where the plants are putting in these ideas for us to create art. And we're going to start off this episode by looking at the end of chapter 4, and it's called Under the Influence, Art and Psychedelics. So you can see that I felt like it made more sense to have it here in chapter 5, because then the next section of chapter 5 is called The Beanstalk, Plants in Literature, Plays, and Poetry. And then Plants as Muse is the last section of the 5th chapter, and that is Plants in Contemporary Culture. So if you want to learn more about how plants have infiltrated our consciousness as far as us making art, stay tuned. Okay, so the first section is called Under the Influence, Art and Psychedelics, and it starts off with a really great quote by Alex Gray, who I showed a lot of his art last week, so you can go check me out on Instagram, Grounded Spirits. There I posted a lot of his stuff. But anyway, he talks about once you have this vision in your head, it's really hard to not put it into the physical act of making art. That when you have a psychedelic experience, and I don't even necessarily think that it has to be psychedelic, it's just whenever you're on drugs, whenever you're under the influence, I would say even with alcohol, I feel like sometimes I get creative under that influence too. But especially for, now talking about me specifically, especially with weed, it's gonna sound so weird. I microdosed weed when I wrote my book Monterey, the first one. And even before I smoked, and I'll tell you right now how I microdosed. So what I did is I mixed the cannabis flower with rose petals. I put in a tea bag, I cut open the tea bag and dumped it out in there, and then I had some tobacco left over from a time that I was making a swisher, so I mixed that all up. And so what it did is it gave me a really nice high where everything was still very clear, and I didn't go too deep into the high where I would get lost in La La Land. I really loved the mixture that I made to be able to still channel and still have a clear opening to the spirit realm, but still remaining in the physical, so that I was able to write this book. But even before that, I had this vision. So I wrote the book in July. I wrote it in 3 weeks. So let's say the middle of June to the beginning of July is when I wrote the book. But I had a vision of me being behind a bee, flying over, not behind a bee, behind a guy who was on a bee, overlooking flowers. They were orange and pink and yellow and really beautiful. And funny enough, that scene didn't show up in the first book. It's in the second book in chapter 3, and that book has yet to be released. So it's coming soon, though. But if you want to read the first one so that you're ready for the second one, you can go to my link in the bio, and it's called Monterey. So that is that. But anyway, so what Alex Gray is saying is that it's so important to be able to, when you are tripping and you do have these visions, to be able to make them, to bring them into the physical realm. And he does it through his art. I do it through my literature. But anybody could do it like in any creative way, So I just think that it's really cool, like how once we are, like when we are tripping, like we have such an amazing experience. So like the first time that I did shrooms, I literally could feel the emotions of the trees. I was in a forest up in San Fran, so it was a really cool experience. And so like these kinds of experiences you don't forget is my point. So in this section, they talk about how psychedelic art is a term that emerged in the 60s and that it celebrates a return both to the land and to oneself. Its expressive manifestations range from traditional painting and sculpture to film and digital composition. And it goes on to talk about like how it has like very vivid colors, geometric patterns, conceptual ideas are the hallmark of viewing the universe through the multicolored lens of the mystic. So it's like all of it is like bringing us back to like the oneness of the creator, but then also of earth and of ourselves. It then goes to talk about how it acts as a creative conduit for inner exploration manifested into inspiring material form. So now we're on the first section of chapter 5. It's called The Beanstalk, Plants and Literature. And it starts off with a quote by John Muir saying, "The clearest way into the universe is through the forest wilderness." And it's so cool because they're saying that in every story you can possibly think of, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be, like the setting is going to be in the forest. And think about it, like think about Disney, for instance. The Jungle Book, Cinderella, the carriage comes from a pumpkin. Snow White, she is poisoned by an apple. Sleeping Beauty, they talk about like the original Sleeping Beauty, that she was actually, her finger's supposed to get pricked by a rose thorn instead of the spindle that we see in Disney. But just in general, like even like King Arthur stories and indigenous stories. So I'm reading another book. I'm going to mispronounce the title of it, but it's Tsawalk. So like Sawak. And he says that we all come around the fireplace, or like the campfire, to tell stories, and we often start in the middle of the story. So like what comes before it, we don't need to talk about what comes before it, because all of our stories are set in nature, so we already know what comes before it based on our connection to nature. And that's so beautiful. But anyway, so in the book they talk about like Shakespeare uses it a lot. They talk about like the Grimm brothers, Jack and the Beanstalk, Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, Oz, The Wizard of Oz has like poppies in it, I guess. The original Beauty and the Beast from 1740, the dad got captured by the beast because he was picking a rose. And of course we know in the Disney one that's supposed to like represent like hope and love. Even like where the wild things are. And turns out like haikus came from wanting to celebrate the botanical world. So that's cool. They also mention John Keats, Percy Shelley, William Wordsworth, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman. They mention all of these people who were deeply inspired by nature. Then they go into like Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, which launched the environmental movement in the 60s. They go to Robin Wall Kimmer, whose book Braiding Sweetgrass that I've talked about so much on this podcast. How her book is also about nature and about becoming one with nature. I'm going to read you this quote by Edward Abbey. He says, "Wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit, and as vital to our lives as water and good bread. A civilization which destroys what little remains of the wild, the spare, the original, is cutting itself off from its origins and betraying the principle of civilization itself. Crazy. But yeah, so think about a story that doesn't have nature in it, you know? Even I'm thinking like Inside Out isn't like super naturey, but I feel like it kind of is because it's showing like how our human nature works. So even stuff like that. Alice in Wonderland, if I haven't already mentioned it, I just wanted to say this little bit about the thing that we have, like the cars have to paint the white roses red, and it's supposed to be symbolizing that the queen prefers violence and fury as opposed to kindness and purity that the white flowers represent. So the next section is plants as muse, so we'll get to that after. And we're back with plants as muse, nature and contemporary culture. So in this section, they're just going over a bunch of different artists that drew plants. So obviously like Monet is in there, Henri Matisse is there, Salvador Dali. Let's see, who else is here? Van Gogh. And they just basically say that everybody is always so intrigued by plants. And then there's a great quote by Georgia O'Keeffe who talks about how in fast-paced cities such as New York, nobody really stops to smell the roses, as the saying goes. But she's saying that she's taking these pictures because when you look at a flower, it's like its own little universe. And she wants to like bring awareness to that and to make people stop and look at flowers. And so I think that's like a really cool sentiment. She was saying like how it's such a reciprocal, not process, but a reciprocal energy, I guess you could say, of her with these plants that like her art is her thank you to the earth for creating such beautiful things. And so I thought that was nice. Of course, Georgia O'Keeffe is a great photographer of flowers, and in this book, they show her datura plant artwork. My critique of this section is that they talk about all of these really cool paintings, and then they show like 100 of art projects. So I say art projects because they're not all paintings. Some of them are drawings, some of them are multimedia. You get me. But like, why not show the ones that you're actually talking about? So that was like my only like beef with it. But the paintings are all really gorgeous, of course, just like all the ones that we had seen before this section. So I felt like it was kind of overdone, showing more paintings or art projects that first of all aren't even about what they're talking about, and then second of all, they look like just like all the other ones. Like this, not that one stood out over the others. So that was just like my only little critique. But that's the end of this book. So I wanted to read to you, they have like a little, I don't even know what to call it, a final note. And it says, "For the seekers." And what they're saying here is that only transcendental philosophy knows the path. Only the illuminated reason can carry the understanding part of man upward toward the light. Only philosophy can teach man to be born well, to live well, to die well, in a perfect measure, be born again. And in perfect measure, be born again. Into this band of the elect, those who have chosen this life of knowledge, of virtue, and of utility, the philosophers of the age invite you. So basically it's saying like, this is the end of this book, but hopefully it has given you enough to want to go out and explore more for yourself and to forge a relationship with the natural world for yourself. And it's paired with an art piece of a unicorn by Jofa Boschart from the Netherlands in 1980, and it's really gorgeous. But I think it's like showing that the impossible, of what we think could be impossible, like it should be like a starting point for us as we dive more into the world of plant magic. So yeah, that is the book. I'll post some pictures on Instagram so you can take a look of the final chapter. If you have any questions, please DM me on Grounded Spirits on Instagram or email me groundedspirits@gmail.com. So yeah, that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this series of plant magic. Let me know if I should do more of going over full books, or should I go back to what I used to do where I would just pull out quotes from my favorite books and talk more about them and go in depth with them. So let me know like what format you would like for the next one. So we're going to be looking at the emerald tablets, and it's just like the little bit that I know about them. Like I know that we're in for a big treat because they're written on these stones that they say that are indestructible and that they have been around for thousands of years. So even that in of itself is really cool, that somebody took the time to write this out onto a surface that would withstand time. So to really see like what was so important, like what words were so important to be written on these tablets. And the first lines of it say that it was written by Thoth, and okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Thoth. He was an Egyptian god, so they say, but he refers to himself as an Atlantean king. But then he was also reincarnated as Hermes in Greece in the 3rd century. And he's the one that started like Hermeticism. So he's a really interesting character. We're going to talk more about him next week as we read the first book. I believe there's 12 books or tablets, but don't quote me on that. I'll learn more when we get there. So, yeah, I will see you all next week. Bye, everybody.